Every now and then, a game will come along that's within your genre of choice, but just goes about it in a totally new way. I can't think of too many times this has happened for me, but one of those times was in 2008 when EA and DICE gave us Mirror's Edge, a grounded, first-person, parkour-driven 3D action platformer game set within a big metropolis. I'm kinda reluctant to outright call this one a 3D platformer because it's maybe a bit of a stretch, but I'd say a lot of the things I typically enjoy about that genre, like taking environmental cues into account and generally having quick reactions to things, all carry over to here, so it is kind of a platformer game, I guess? I don't know. Still, either which way, I thought this would be a pretty interesting one to take a look at because it went about its mechanics and controls and general presentation in a way totally different to most other games out there at the time. So much so that I distinctly remember that when this game first came out and I first played it, I did not like it at all. I've definitely played this a few more times over the years and liked it more on subsequent playthroughs, but yeah, that first impression of this back then was not good. I guess I'd say Mirror's Edge is a bit of an underdog in the grand scheme of things, being a game that sold okay at the time, but ended up getting a pretty big cult following in the years that followed, with a few other games out there that must have been at least a little bit inspired by some of the things it did. And of course, we eventually kind of got a sequel, sort of, maybe. Yeah, I don't know, I'll go into that one some other time. Anyway, I've picked up an Xbox 360 copy because I felt like playing it again anyway, and with that, let's check out Mirror's Edge, a game that's pretty unique and unlike any other. Except for this. Oh, and just a quick mention, while I am playing the Xbox 360 version, I am going to play it through on my Series X, which, if that didn't make a difference, I wouldn't have bought it up, but it's the reason all the gameplay footage is 60 FPS instead of 30 FPS. I would go more into it than that, but, you know, I'm not really a technical analysis kind of guy, and I'd much rather talk about more interesting things than the frame rates, so yeah, that's what I'm going to do. First things first, the opening logos and title screen for this game are so good. Just look at this title screen, it is so clean looking, and you'll quickly see that the entire game has that same clean and high contrast kind of look going on. I think this was literally one of the goals of the development team at the time, to make it so their game could be easily identified from almost any screenshot taken from almost anywhere in the game, and yeah, I'd say they managed to achieve that for the most part. But if there's one thing I reckon DICE didn't do quite so well, it's the story, because it's pretty vague most of the time, more so within the duration of whatever narrative we have here, because for what it's worth, I do think the general premise and the backstory for the world of Mirror's Edge is a pretty good idea. It's just the story that then gets told with all of that doesn't really go anywhere. Basically, in this version of the not too distant future, there's a bunch of giant evil corporations that kind of control everything really, and it's reached a point where the average person is tracked non-stop 24 hours a day and literally has no privacy whatsoever. Yeah, there's some tragic irony going on there in hindsight, but anyway, this introduces the Runners into the equation, a group of people that deliver good old-fashioned messages written on paper and through other physical mediums that need to be hand-delivered and fast in order to keep away from the evil corporate police or whatever. It's simple enough, but I think it's a pretty fun idea to be honest, and it seems totally justified to have people running around doing all of this stuff if everybody's being spied on all the time. And yeah, we play as Faith, who is one of those runners on the front line. You do learn a little bit more about her past at one point, but not very much, and I think it's where this game picks up that things get a little messy and vague. There's a guy running for mayor who then gets killed, and Faith's sister, who's an actual police officer, gets the blame for it, even though it wasn't her. And then later on there's some kind of conspiracy surrounding it all. I mean, it does have some good elements to it though, you know? It's all about the little guys versus the big guys, and then you've got some action, some espionage, and a bit of betrayal in there too. But the whole thing, mainly towards the end, it just kind of happens, and I can never really remember what those things are. But it's like I said earlier on, I think the general premise of this is pretty neat, and it does a good enough job because it lays the groundwork for this more grounded take on 3D platforming that we'd never really seen done before this, and it's a good job too because the gameplay really is where it's at with this one. The main aim of the game is to get to where you want to be for whatever reason the story gives you. Nice. to do this, you'll have to do a lot of literal legwork, running around, sliding under things, hopping over things, wall running, you name it. But it's all done in this very grounded sort of way, and only ever from this first-person perspective. And to do all of this, you've got to use the shoulder and trigger buttons on the left side of the controller, with the trigger being for lower actions like ducking, sliding and rolling, and the shoulder button being for higher actions like jumping, climbing and vaulting. This does take some getting used to because of how different it is to pretty much everything else that was around at the time, and it's not perfect. There are a few times where I feel like Faith wouldn't move in the way I would want her to, or that sometimes the weighted controls kinda work against you in a way that's really hard to describe, but you do get a decent tutorial area to go through which shows you how everything works, and then it lets you run around to practice afterwards for as long as you like, and the first proper level of the game isn't too difficult either. But with a bit of time, it starts to become almost second nature and pretty comfortable, even when doing more advanced things like combining the high and low inputs for certain moves, or combining everything with a quick turn for jumping back and forth. I do also have to give credit for all of these actions being mapped in a way that doesn't interfere with your use of the camera. You can kind of get away with not constantly moving the camera around in most third-person platformers, but that luxury gets thrown out of the window when playing from this perspective, so I'm glad you can just keep a hold of that right stick. Unfortunately, this does mean the game is prone to giving some people motion sickness, which I hadn't even considered until I spoke about this game with one of my friends, because I don't really suffer with that kind of stuff when I play games. But if you do, then yeah, Mirror's Edge is probably not going to work out for you. But yeah, going back to the controls, there is almost a rhythm to it after a while. Little things like remembering to use the lower actions to soften your landing by doing a little roll at the end of a high jump. It feels satisfying because if you do it right, you can keep up that momentum, which is precisely what Mirror's Edge is all about. When you get to some of these high stakes set pieces and you're almost dancing and flowing around all of the obstacles that fly your way, you almost go into this kind of zen-like state, and it feels really good to get through this, which makes the occasional bit of jank feel 10 times worse than it would have done on its own. And it is such a shame when this happens, because I can't stand here and lie and say, oh, you know, don't worry about it, the jankiness never shows up, because it does, and while it doesn't show up too often, it does show up every now and then, and when it does rear its ugly head, man, that jankiness is such a buzzkill. Still, I think another thing that adds to that fresh feeling Mirror's Edge has going on is the art style, because regardless of how you're playing this game, it looks great, even now, over 15 years later. Oh wow, that was a long time ago. The story does take place in the future, I guess, but I like that it still looks like a fairly normal cityscape that could exist today. You know, it hasn't gone full-on science fiction. At least, not yet, anyway. And within the City of Glass, there's a lot of industrial-looking parts to it, but it's all presented really cleanly with shades of white and grey and splashes of colour here and there to help point out key things. I also like that different areas of the city use different colours to do this, with orange rooftops, yellow construction sites, blue subway stations, green office buildings, and even a couple levels at night that use those along with some very particular lighting to guide your eyes along the way. It's surprisingly diverse looking throughout the entire game, but it all still fits in with that minimalistic, clean aesthetic that they were going for. But out of all the colours on your screen, red is probably the most important one to look out for, with this not really being a part of the world itself, but more like a representation of Faith's intuition and training as a runner. As you're running around, you'll occasionally have items turn red in the distance, and these are here to guide you along a traversable path. You can turn this off completely, but I always did find it useful on the odd occasion I forgot where to go, or maybe it isn't quite so clear where you're supposed to go, because that does happen, and I think this is a pretty non-intrusive solution. You know, if a character tells you on the radio to head to a nearby tower, then that tower will become red, and any red items on the ground will help you reach it. It's simple enough, it's easy to understand, and I feel like even now there isn't another game that pulls this specific kind of thing off as well as Mirror's Edge. Yeah, even this one. Oh yeah, and we've also got these cutscenes. I remember these being a negative point from a lot of reviewers back in the day, and I remember thinking they looked a little bit out of place at the time as well, but these days, they've really grown on me. I kind of admire that DICE weren't going for super detailed CG that made the in-game visuals seem worse by comparison. I've seen plenty of that in my time.
You lost me.
but instead they just kind of went for something more stylized and stand out. Again, it's very Mirror's Edge, you're not going to mistake this for any other game, which does work in its favour, but I do get why a lot of people aren't into this though, because it's pretty jarring going from rotoscoped 2D animation to first-person 3D gameplay. But whatever, I think they look cool, so there you go. All the while, this game has some banging music and sound design. The main theme and the menu ambience are highlights of the soundtrack for me, and in-game the music gets really upbeat for the more frantic chase sequences. The sound of every footstep has some real weight to it as well, with Faith's feet hitting the concrete, and even things like the sound of metal as you crawl through air vents, or the clicks of the elevator buttons as she presses them. Everything just sounds really good. This is definitely a game you should play with some headphones on if you get the chance. In fact, now I think about it, I've got to say this really was the first time I felt like I was actually within the shoes of the character I was playing as, instead of just a floating camera with a pair of arms holding a gun like in most other FPS games. There's just a lot of little details, like constantly seeing Faith's arms as she's doing her parkour moves and sprinting around, to seeing her reflection in certain scenes. I mean, the simple fact that you can look down and see her body as you move around, combined with the physics generally being fairly accurate to the real world. I don't know, I guess this is just one of those games that feels justifiably first person. You know, I've played a few games before now where the camera is stuck in first person, and I really wished it wasn't, but Mirror's Edge is not one of those games. So, everything's mostly smelled of roses so far, but if there's one more way for me to make another comparison to this basically being a 3D platformer game, it would have to be the fact that Mirror's Edge, despite having some pretty slick movement systems in place, falls into the same platformer trap I've seen so many others fall into, because wow, does this game trip over and fall straight onto its face when it comes to the combat. I feel like I've gone over this a million times, but I think enemies in movement-focused action platformers are at their best when they're a quick obstacle, almost like the things you're using to jump around the levels themselves, or at the very least, some kind of gameplay within the same ballpark as the main gameplay you're already doing. And you know what? Screw it, I'm gonna bring it up again. Rayman 3. The combat in this game is so good. You're locking on, you're jumping around, ducking, dodging, throwing curved punches, mixing up your attacks, while still being the big-nosed, bouncy, limbless French thingamajig that you are in the rest of the game. But here, with Mirror's Edge, I mean, I can see how it's supposed to work. You can use your momentum if the enemy is near a wall to kick into them, but that's rarely the case, so I found myself just spamming the duck and attack moves to kick everyone in the balls over and over again. Yeah, it's a pretty cheap shot, but the alternative is Faith actually getting shot, so yeah, kick them nuts. Then you've got this other move you can do, which is to kind of counter-attack enemies, but you've basically got to be stood still and press a button at the exact frame they start to attack you in order to pull this off. And this can be a little tricky to do, so DICE have given us a slow motion ability to help us do it, and that's kind of where it all falls apart, really. You know, the rest of the game is all about running really fast and keeping up that momentum, but it has one of its most effective combat maneuvers to be stand still and slow down time. I think the other worst offender here is that once you knock out an enemy that's carrying a gun, you can then pick up the gun and shoot the other guys with it. I know this was made by DICE and they made a bunch of Battlefield games, but this isn't a Battlefield game, and firing an automatic assault rifle goes completely against the entire point of what this woman does for a living. Do yourself a favor and try to avoid using the guns. I don't really know why they're here, and the game does incentivize you to not use them with an achievement if you care about that sort of thing, but at the end of the day, the combat isn't great, so you may end up just using the gun as a last resort anyway. There's also this one part that almost forces you to use one to blow up a few things. I mean, you can get around that, but the easiest way to get past it is to just pick up a gun and start shooting, so yeah. There's also this one boss fight later on, if you can call it that, where it's almost like doing a quick time event that you can't get out of until you do it correctly, so yeah, have fun doing this over and over again. Okay, so we got some mild spoilers coming up here, I guess, but I don't really think the story is all that deep anyway, so I'm just going to go ahead and mention what little I was able to pick up on here. You know the drill, skip on ahead if you don't want to know what happens, but yeah, you're not really missing much. So, about halfway through the game, it becomes pretty clear that the story is about something called Icarus, which involves a mysterious masked runner working for the conglomerate police force. This runner is there to teach them how to run and essentially take out the actual runners for good. In the end, this doesn't work out, or at least I don't think it does, and the one training them turns out to be Faith's friend that you see a few times throughout the game, which, yeah, I don't think this was as big a plot twist as DICE were hoping for it to be. And after everything, Faith is able to save her sister from this entire conspiracy theory situation she was caught up in, and the two end the game by looking over the city. And that's pretty much it. There is more to it than that, I guess, but despite the fact I've played through Mirror's Edge like 4 times over the years, I have never been able to take that much away from the story. You know, it's one of those games that it does its job in the moment, but I could never tell you anything about the story in great detail afterwards because, I don't know, stuff just kind of happens in a random order and none of it hits my brain hard enough to make an impact and stay in there, you know? I think proof of this for me is that when I'm editing these videos of mine, I do generally remember what things happened in games and roughly when they happened, so I'll skim through footage and I'll be like, oh yeah, at the end of this level we get this cutscene and that's the bit I want to show, so I'll just highlight that, drop it in, and there we go, video editing. But with Mirror's Edge, not only do I not remember where certain events happened, but half of the things that did, I just straight up forgot about, and I only played through this recently. For example, Faith's mentor and the guy that talks to you over the radio throughout most of the game, yeah, apparently he died at one point. When the hell did that happen? I must have seen it because I recorded footage, but I don't remember it at all, and the entire game is like this. At least the same can't be said for the gameplay, and I think a testament to that is the time trial mode. Yeah, so with every chapter of the campaign you complete, you can unlock time trials that take place within those levels, and without the story, without the occasional dialogue interruptions, without the combat, and without the set pieces, this is actually a pretty friggin' addictive game mode. I went into this mode thinking I'll just grab a few minutes of footage here and there, but I ended up playing this for well over an hour. It's just pretty fun to try and get an absolute perfect run without any trip-ups and trying to see if you can't find any better routes to finish each trial even faster. I also found out there's a DLC pack for this game that I had no idea existed until now. I picked it up to see what it's like, and it does add a bunch of these super minimalistic floating levels which do look nice, but I felt like these were lacking in that sort of natural flow that the regular time trials have. You do also have to kind of relearn the visual language of the game because everything is so abstract, and I think the familiarity you're going to have with the original time trial layouts thanks to playing the story mode really does help those out, whereas here, I don't know, I just kind of feel like I'm stuck in Cooler World. Bit of a waste of £4 there on my part, but oh well. Just stick with the regular time trials, I thought they were plenty fun enough. So, while there's a few hang-ups like the story not being all that special, the combat being whatever it is, and some very occasional jank in the controls, generally speaking, I think Mirror's Edge does what it was trying to do pretty well, and I am glad I went back to it for another try. I'd also like to think it's pretty easy to see why so many people remember this one. After all was said and done, Mirror's Edge sold fairly well from what I can tell, and it definitely wedged its way into being one of those cult classic games that a lot of people still enjoy, and to this day, I still don't think there's anything out there quite like it. Except this. Yeah, so, I never did get round to finishing this one back when it first came out for whatever reason, and right now I really am in the mood for more of this kind of gameplay, so I'll take a breather and then hit the ground running with a look at Mirror's Edge Catalyst in the not too distant future.